Hello friends, and welcome to this autumnal bedtime story. If you enjoy these readings, I would encourage you to subscribe, so you will be notified of upcoming sleep stories. I thank you for your support. Before we begin the narration, let us unwind. Find yourself a place where you can relax. Your chair, or maybe your bed. Make yourself comfortable. After you have settled in, take a deep breath. The day has come to an end. All that is left for you to do now is to listen to these stories and fall asleep. And so, let us begin. An October ride. It was a fine afternoon, just warm enough and just cool enough, and I started off alone on horseback, though I do not know why I should say alone, when I find my horse such good company. She is called Sheila, and she not only gratifies one's sense of beauty, but it is very interesting in her character, while her usefulness in this world is beyond question. I grow more fond of her every week. We have had so many capital good times together, and I am certain that she is as much pleased as I when we start out for a run. I do not say to every one that I always pronounce her name in German fashion, because she occasionally shies. But that is the truth. I do not mind her shying, or a certain mysterious and apparently unprovoked jump, with which she sometimes indulges herself, and no one else rides her, so I think she does no harm. But I do not like the principle of allowing her to be wicked, unrebuked and unhindered, and some day I shall give my mind to admonishing this four-footed Princess of Thule, who seems at present to consider herself at the top of royalty in this kingdom or any other. I believe I should not like her half so well if she were tamer and entirely and stupidly reliable. I glory in her good spirits, and I think she has a right to be proud and wilful if she chooses. I am proud myself of her quick eye and ear, her sure foot, and her slender, handsome chestnut head. I look at her points of high breeding with admiration, and I thank her heartily for all the pleasure she has given me, and for what I am sure is a steadfast friendship between us, and a mutual understanding that rarely knows a disappointment or a mistake. She is careful when I come home late through the shadowy, twilighted woods, and I can hardly see my way. She forgets then all her little tricks and capers, and is as steady as a clock with her tramp, tramp over the rough, dark country roads. I feel as if I had suddenly grown a pair of wings when she fairly flies over the ground, and the wind whistles in my ears. There never was a time when she could not go a little faster, but she is willing to go step by step through the close woods, pushing her way through the branches, and stopping considerately when a bough that will not bend tries to pull me off the saddle. And she never goes away and leaves me when I dismount to get some flowers or a drink of spring water, though sometimes she thinks what fun it would be. I cannot speak of all her virtues, for I have not learned them yet. We are still new friends, for I have only ridden her 2 years, and I feel all the fascination of the first meeting every time I go out with her. She is so unexpected in her ways, so amusing, so sensible, so brave, and in every way so delightful a horse. It was in October, and it was a fine day to look at, though some of the great clouds that sailed through the sky were a little too heavy-looking to promise good weather on the morrow. And over the west, where the wind was coming from, they were packed close together and looked grey and wet. It might be cold and cloudy later, but that would not hinder my ride. It is a capital way to keep warm, to come along a smooth bit of road on the run, and I should have time at any rate to go the way I wished. So Sheila trotted quickly through the gate and out of the village. There was a flicker of colour left on the oaks and maples, and though it was not Indian summer weather, it was first cousin to it. I took off my cap to let the wind blow through my hair. I had half a mind to go down to the sea, but it was too late for that. There was no moon to light me home. Sheila took the strip of smooth turf just at the side of the road for her own highway. She tossed ahead again and again until I had my hand full of her thin, silky mane, and she gave me quick pulls at her bit and hurried little jumps ahead as if she expected me already to pull the reins tight and steady her for a hard gallop. I patted her and whistled at her. I was so glad to see her again and to be out riding, and I gave her part of her reward to begin with, because I knew she would earn it, and then we were on better terms than ever. She has such a pretty way of turning her head to take the square lump of sugar, and she never bit my fingers or dropped the sugar in her life. Down in the lower part of the town, on the edge of York, there is a long tract of woodland, covering what is called the Rocky Hills. Rough, high land that stretches along from beyond Agamenticus near the sea to the upper part of Elliot, near the Piscataqua River. Standing on Agamenticus, the woods seem to cover nearly the whole of the country as far as one can see, and there is hardly a clearing to break this long reach of forest of which I speak. There must be 20 miles of it in an almost unbroken line. The roads cross it here and there, and one can sometimes see small and lonely farms hiding away in the heart of it. The trees are for the most part young growth of oak or pine, though I could show you yet many a noble company of great pines that once have been marked with the king's arrow, and many a royal old oak which has been overlooked in the search for ship's knees and plank for the navy yard, and piles for the always shaky, uphill and down, pleasant old Portsmouth Bridge. The part of these woods which I know best lies on either side the already old new road to York on the Rocky Hills, and here I often ride, or even take perilous rough drives through the cart paths, the wood roads which are busy thoroughfares in the winter, and are silent and shady, narrowed by green branches and carpeted with slender brakes, and seldom travelled over, except by me, all summer long. It was a great surprise, or a succession of surprises, one summer, when I found that every one of the old uneven tracks led to, or at least led by, what had once been a clearing, and in old days must have been the secluded home of some of the earliest adventurous farmers of this region. It must have taken great courage, I think, to strike the first blow of one's axe here in the woods, and it must have been a brave certainty of one's perseverance that looked forward to the smooth field which was to succeed the unfruitful wilderness. The farms were far enough apart to be very lonely, and I suppose at first the cry of fierce wild creatures in the forest was an everyday sound. There are some of these farms still occupied, where the land seems to have become thoroughly civilized, but most of them were deserted long ago. The people gave up the fight with such a persistent willfulness and wildness of nature, and went away to the village, or to find more tractable soil and kindlier neighborhoods. I do not know why it is these silent forgotten places are so delightful to me. There is one which I always call my farm, and it was a long time after I knew it well before I could find out to whom it had once belonged. In some strange way, the place has become a part of my world, and to belong to my thoughts and life. I suppose every one can say, I have a little kingdom where I give laws. Each of us has truly a kingdom in thought, and a certain spiritual possession. There are some gardens of mine where somebody plants the seeds and pulls the weeds for me every year, without my ever taking a bit of trouble. I have trees and fields and woods and seas and houses. I own a great deal of the world to think and plan and dream about. The picture belongs most to the man who loves it best and sees entirely its meaning. We can always have just as much as we can take of things, and we can lay up as much treasure as we please in the higher world of thought that can never be spoiled or hindered by moth or rust, as lower and meaner wealth can be. As for this farm of mine, I found it one day when I was coming through the woods on horseback, trying to strike a shorter way out into the main road. I was pushing through some thick underbrush, and looking ahead I noticed a good deal of clear sky, as if there were an open place just beyond. And presently I found myself on the edge of a clearing. There was a straggling orchard of old apple trees. The grass about them was close and short like the wide dooryard of an old farmhouse, and into this cleared space the little pines were growing on every side. The old pines stood a little way back, watching the children march in upon their inheritance, as if they were ready to interfere and protect and defend if any trouble came. I could see that it would not be many years if they were left alone before the green grass would be covered, and the old apple trees would grow mossy and die for lack of room and sunlight in the midst of the young woods. It was a perfect acre of turf, only here and there I could already see a cushion of juniper, or a tuft of sweet fern, or bayberry. I walked the horse about slowly, picking a hard little yellow apple here and there from the boughs over my head, and at last I found a cellar all grown over with grass, with not even a bit of crumbling brick to be seen in the hollow of it. No doubt there were some underground. It was a very large cellar, twice as large as any I had ever found before in any of these deserted places, in the woods or out. And that told me at once that there had been a large house above it, an unusual house for those old days. The family was either a large one, or it had made for itself more than a merely sufficient covering and shelter, with no inch of unnecessary room. I knew I was on very high land, but the trees were so tall and close that I could not see beyond them. The wind blew over pleasantly, and it was a curiously protected and hidden place, sheltered and quiet, with its one small crop of cider apples dropping ungathered to the ground, and unharvested there except by hurrying black ants and sticky, witless little snails. I suppose my feeling toward this place was like that about a ruin. Only this seemed older than a ruin. I could not hear my horse's footfalls, and an apple startled me when it fell with a soft thud, and I watched it roll a foot or two and then stop, as if it knew it never would have anything more to do in the world. I remembered the enchanted place and the sleeping beauty in the wood, and it seemed as if I were on the way to it, and this was a corner of that palace garden. The horse listened and stood still, without a bit of restlessness, and when we heard the far cry of a bird, she looked round at me, as if she wished me to notice that we were not alone in the world after all. It was strange, to be sure, that people had lived there, and had had a home where they were busy, and where the fortunes of life had found them, that they had followed out the law of existence, in its succession of growth and flourishing and failure and decay, within that steadily narrowing circle of trees. The relationship of untamed nature to what is tamed and cultivated is a very curious and subtle thing to me. I do not know if everyone feels it so intensely. In the darkness of an early autumn evening, I sometimes find myself whistling a queer tune that chimes in with the crickets piping and the cries of the little creatures around me in the garden. I have no thought of the rest of the world. I wonder what I am. There is a strange self-consciousness, but I am only a part of one great existence, which is called nature. The life in me is a bit of all life, and where I am happiest is where I find that which is next of kin to me, in friends or trees or hills or seas, or beside a flower, when I turn back more than once to look into its face. The world goes on year after year. We can use its forces and shape and mold them, and perfect this thing or that. But we cannot make new forces. We only use the tools we find to carve the wood we find. There is nothing new. We discover and combine and use. Here is the wild fruit, the same fruit at heart as that with which the gardener wins his prize. The world is the same world. You find a diamond, but the diamond was there 1,000 years ago. You did not make it by finding it. We grow spiritually until we grasp some new great truth of God. But it was always true, and waited for us until we came. What is there new and strange in the world except ourselves? Our thoughts are our own. God gives our life to us moment by moment, but He gives it to be our own. Ye on your harps must lean to hear a secret chord that mine will bear. As I look about me, that day I saw the difference that man had made slowly fading out of sight. It was like a dam in a river. When it is once swept away, the river goes on the same as before. The old patient, sublime forces were there at work in their appointed way. But perhaps by and by, when the apple trees are gone and the cellar is only a rough hollow in the woods, someone will again set aside these forces that have worked unhindered, and will bring this corner of the world into a new use and shape. What if we could stop, or change forever the working of these powers? But nature repossesses herself surely of what we boldly claim. The pyramids stand yet, it happens. But where are all those cities that used also to stand in old Egypt? Proud and strong, and dating back beyond man's memories or traditions, turned into sand again, and dust that is like all the rest of the desert, and blows about in the wind. Yet there cannot be such a thing as life that is lost. The tree falls and decays in the dampness of the woods, and is part of the earth underfoot, but another tree is growing out of it. Perhaps it is part of its own life that is springing again from the part of it that died. God must always be putting again to some use the life that is withdrawn. It must live because it is life. There can be no confusion to God in this wonderful world, the new birth of the immortal, the new form of this life that is from everlasting to everlasting, or the new way in which it comes. But it is only God who can plan and order it all, who is a father to his children and cares for the least of us. I thought of his unprovoked promises. The people who lived and died in that lonely place knew him, and the chain of events was fitted to their thoughts and lives, for their development and education. The world was made for them, and God keeps them yet. Somewhere in his kingdom they are in their places. They are not lost, while the trees they left grow older, and the young trees spring up, and the fields they cleared are being covered over and turned into wild land again. I had visited this farm of mine many times since that first day, but since the last time I had been there I had found out, luckily, something about its last tenant. An old lady whom I knew in the village had told me that when she was a child she remembered another very old woman who used to live here all alone, far from any neighbors, that one afternoon she had come with her mother to see her. She remembered the house very well. It was larger and better than most houses in the region. Its owner was the last of her family, but why she lived alone, or what became of her at last, or of her money or her goods, or who were her relatives in the town, my friend did not know. She was a thrifty, well-to-do old soul, a famous weaver and spinner, and she used to come to the meeting-house at the old fields every Sunday, and sit by herself in a square pew. Since I knew this, the last owner of the farm has become very real to me, and I thought of her that day a great deal, and could almost see her as she sat alone on her doorstep in the twilight of a summer evening, when the thrushes were calling in the woods, or going down the hills to church, dressed in quaint fashion, with a little sadness in her face as she thought of her lost companions, and how she did not use to go to church alone. And I pictured her funeral to myself, and watched her carried away at last by the narrow road that wound among the trees. And there was nobody left in the house after the neighbors from the nearest farms had put it to rights, and had looked over her treasures to their heart's content. She must have been a fearless woman, and one could not stay in such a place as this, year in and year out, through the long days of summer and the long nights of winter, unless she found herself good company. I do not think I could find a worse avenue than that which leads to my farm. I think sometimes there must have been an easier way out, which I have yet failed to discover. But it has its advantages, for the trees are beautiful and stand close together, and I do not know such green breaks anywhere as those which grow in the shadiest places. I came into a well-trodden track after a while, which led into a small granite quarry, and then I could go faster. And at last I reached the pasture wall, which was quickly left behind, and I was only a little way from the main road. There were a few young cattle scattered about in the pasture, and some of them, which were lying down, got up in a hurry, and stared at me suspiciously as I rode along. It was very uneven ground, and I passed some stiff, straight mullein stalks, which stood apart together in a hollow, as if they wished to be alone. They always remind me of the rigid, old Scotch Covenanters, who used to gather themselves together in companies, against the law, to worship God in some secret hollow of the bleak hillside. Even the smallest and youngest of the mulleins was a Covenanter at heart. They had all put by their yellow flowers, and they will stand there, grey and unbending, through the fall rains and winter snows, to keep their places and praise God in their old fashion. And they take great credit to themselves for doing it, I have no doubt, and think it is far better to be a stern and respectable mullen than a straying, idle clematis that clings and wanders, and cannot bear wet weather. I saw members of the congregations gathered through the pasture, and felt like telling them to hurry, for the long sermon had already begun. But one ancient worthy, very late on his way to the meeting, happened to stand in our way, and Sheila bit his dry head off, which was a great pity. After I was once on the high road, it was not long before I found myself in another part of the town altogether. It is great fun to ride about the country. One rouses a great deal of interest. There seems to be something exciting in the sight of a girl on horseback, and people who pass you in wagons turn to look after you, though they never would take the trouble if you were only walking. The country horses shy if you go by them fast, and sometimes you stop to apologize. The boys will leave anything to come and throw a stone at your horse. I think Sheila would like to bite a boy, though sometimes she goes through her best paces when she hears them hooting, as if she thought they were admiring her, which I never allow myself to doubt. It is considered a much greater compliment if you make a call on horseback than if you came afoot, but carriage people are nothing in the country to what they are in the city. I was on a good road, and Sheila was trotting steadily, and I did not look at the western sky behind me, until I suddenly noticed that the air had grown colder, and the sun had been for a long time behind a cloud. Then I found there was going to be a shower, in a very little while too. I was in a thinly settled part of town, and at first I could not think of any shelter, until I remembered that not very far distant there was an old house with a long, sloping roof, which had formerly been the parsonage of the North Parish. There had once been a church nearby, to which most of the people came, who lived in this upper part of the town. It had been for many years the house of an old minister, of widespread fame in his day. I had always heard of him from the elderly people, and had often thought I should like to go into his house, and had looked at it with great interest. But until within a year or two, there had been people living there. I had even listened with pleasure to a story of its being haunted, and this was a capital chance to take a look at the old place, so I hurried toward it. As I went in at the broken gate, it seemed to me as if the house might have been shut up and left to itself 50 years before, when the minister died. So soon the grass grows up after men's footsteps have worn it down, and the traces are lost of the daily touch and care of their hands. The home lot was evidently part of a pasture, and the sheep had nibbled close to the doorstep, while tags of their long spring wool, washed clean by summer rains, were caught in the rose bushes near by. It had been a very good house in its day, and had a dignity of its own, holding its grey head high, as if it knew itself to be not merely a farmhouse, but a parsonage. The roof looked as if the next winter's weight of snow might break it in, and the window panes had been loosened so much in their shaking frames that many of them had fallen out on the north side of the house, and were lying on the long grass underneath, blurred and thin, but still unbroken. That was the letter of the house's death warrant, for now the rain could get in, and the crumbling timbers must lose their hold of each other quickly. I found a dry corner of the old shed for the horse, and left her there, looking most ruefully over her shoulder after me as I hurried away, for the rain had already begun to spatter down in earnest. I was not sorry when I found that somebody had broken a pane of glass in the sidelight of the front door, near the latch, and I was very pleased when I found that by reaching through I could unfasten a great bolt and let myself in, as perhaps some tramp in search of shelter had done before me. However, I gave the blackened brass knocker a ceremonious rap or two, and I could have told by the sound of it, if no other way, that there was nobody at home. I looked up to see a robin's nest on the cornice overhead, and I had to push away the lilacs and a withering hop vine which were both trying to cover up the door. It gives one a strange feeling, I think, to go into an empty house so old as this. It was so still there that the noise my footsteps made startled me, and the floor creaked and cracked as if someone followed me about. There was hardly a straw left, or a bit of string or paper, but the rooms were much worn. The bricks in the fireplaces were burnt out, rough and crumbling, and the doors were all worn smooth and round at the edges. The best rooms were wainscoted, but upstairs there was a long, unfinished room, with a little square window at each end, under the sloping roof, and as I listened there to the rain, I remembered that I had once heard an old man say wistfully that he had slept in just such a linter chamber as this when he was a boy, and that he never could sleep anywhere now so well as he used there while the rain fell on the roof just over his bed. Downstairs I found a room which I knew must have been the study. It was handsomely wainscoted, and the finish of it was even better than that of the parlor. It must have been a most comfortable place, and I fear the old parson was luxurious in his tastes, and less aesthetic, perhaps, than the more puritanical members of his congregation approved. There was a great fireplace with a broad hearthstone, where I think he may have made a mug of flip sometimes, and there were several curious, narrow little cupboards built into the wall at either side, and over the fireplace itself 2 doors opened, and there were shelves inside, broader at the top as the chimney sloped back. I saw some writing on one of those doors, and went nearer to read it. There was a date at the top, some time in 1802, and his reverence had had a good quill pen and ink which bravely stood the test of time. He must have been a tall man to have written so high. I thought it might be some record of a great storm or other notable event in his house or parish, but I was amused to find that he had written there, on the unpainted wood, some valuable recipes for the medical treatment of horses. It is useful for a sprain and for a cough. Take of elecampane, and so on. I hope he was not a hunting parson, but one could hardly expect to find any reference to the early fathers or federal headship in Adam on the cupboard. I thought of the stories I had heard of the old minister, and felt very well acquainted with him, though his books had been taken down and his fire was out, and he himself had gone away. I was glad to think what a good, faithful man he was, who spoke comfortable words to his people and lived pleasantly with them in this quiet country place so many years. There are old people living who have told me that nobody preaches nowadays as he used to preach, and that he used to lift his hat to everybody, that he liked a good dinner and always was kind to the poor. I thought as I stood in the study how many times he must have looked out of the small paned western windows across the fields, and how in his later days he must have had a treasure of memories of the people who had gone out of that room the better for his advice and consolation. the people whom he had helped and taught and ruled. I could not imagine that he ever angrily took his parishioners to ask for the errors of doctrine. Indeed, it was not of his active youth and middle age that I thought at all, but of the last of his life, when he sat here in the sunshine of a winter afternoon, and the fire flickered and snapped on the hearth, and he sat before it in his armchair with a brown old book which he laid on his knee, while he thought and dozed, and roused himself presently to greet somebody who came in, a little awed at first, to talk with him. It was a great thing to be a country minister in those old days, and to be sure, a minister as he was, truly a priest and ruler of his people. The times have changed, and the temporal power certainly is taken away. The divine right of ministers is almost as little believed in as that of kings, by many people. It is not possible for the influence to be so great. The office and the man are both looked at with less reverence. It is a pity that it should be so. But the conservative people who liked old-fashioned ways cannot tell where to place all the blame. And it is very odd to think that these iconoclastic and unpleasant new times of ours will, a little later, be called old times, and that the children, when they are elderly people, will sigh to have them back again. I was very glad to see the old house, and I told myself a great many stories there, as one cannot help doing in such a place. There must have been so many things happen in so many long lives, which were lived there. People have come into the world and gone out of it again from those square rooms with the little windows, and I believe if there are ghosts who walk about in daylight, I was only half deaf to their voices, and heard much of what they tried to tell me that day. The rooms which had looked empty at first were filled again with the old clergymen, who met together with important looks and complacent dignity, and eager talk about some minor point in theology that is yet unsettled. The awkward, smiling couples who came to be married, the mistress of the house, who must have been a stately person in her day, the little children who, under all their shyness, remembered the sugar plums in the old parson's pockets. All these, and even the tall cane that must have stood in the entry, were visible to my mind's eye. And I even heard a sermon from the old preacher who died so long ago, on the beauty of a life well spent. The rain fell steadily, and there was no prospect of its stopping, though I could see that the clouds were thinner, and that it was only a shower. In the kitchen I found an old chair which I pulled into the study, which seemed more cheerful than the rest of the house, and then I remembered that there were some bits of board in the kitchen also, and the thought struck me that it would be good fun to make a fire in the old fireplace. Everything seemed right about the chimney. I even went up into the garret to look at it there, for I had no wish to set the parsonage on fire, and I brought down a pile of old corn husks for kindlings, which I found on the garret floor. I built my fire carefully, with 2 bricks for andirons, and when I lit it, it blazed up gaily. I poked it, and it crackled, and though I was very well contented there alone, I wished for some friend to keep me company. It was selfish to have so much pleasure with no one to share it. The rain came faster than ever against the windows, and the room would have been dark if it had not been for my fire, which threw out a magnificent yellow light over the old brown woodwork. I leaned back and watched the dry sticks fall apart in red coals, and thought I might have to spend the night there. For if it were a storm and not a shower, I was several miles from home, and a late October rain is not like a warm one in June to fall upon one's shoulders. I could hear the house leaking when it rained less heavily, and the soot dropped down the chimney, and great drops of water came down too, and spluttered in the fire. I thought what a merry thing it would be if a party of young people ever had to take refuge there, and I could almost see their faces and hear them laugh, though until that minute they had been strangers to me. But the shower was over at last, and my fire was out, and the last pale shining of the sun came into the windows, and I looked out to see the distant fields and woods all clear again in the late afternoon light. I must hurry to get home before dark, so I raked up the ashes and left my chair beside the fireplace, and shut and fastened the front door after me, and went out to see what had become of my horse, shaking the dust and cobwebs off my dress as I crossed the wet grass to the shed. The rain had come through the broken roof, and poor Sheila looked anxious and hungry, as if she thought I might have meant to leave her there till morning in that dismal place. I offered her my apologies, but she made even a shorter turn than usual when I had mounted, and we scurried off down the road, spattering ourselves as we went. I hope the ghosts who live in the parsonage watched me with friendly eyes, and I looked back myself to see a thin blue whiff of smoke still come up from the great chimney. I wondered who it was that had made the first fire there, but I think I shall have made the last.